In life, stuff happens. And sometimes it's stuff that you want, and sometimes it's stuff that you don't want. And if it's the latter, you need to get over it. And you need to learn the lessons from failure. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in this video. Now, a way to look at it is that failure is a way of eliminating what doesn't work. And sometimes the only way of finding what works successfully is by ruling out everything else. So you rule out everything that doesn't work and you're left with the one thing that does. And the thing that comes to mind with this is WD-40. And you probably have a can of this around your house somewhere. Most people do. But do you know what WD-40 stands for? I didn't until fairly recently. WD-40 stands for Water Displacement 40th Formula. So the people who were inventing WD-40 went through 39 previous attempts before they managed to get the right formula. So it could easily have been called WD-30 or WD-39 or WD-41 if they'd taken different steps, if things had gone slightly differently. But the fact was that they failed at making this 39 times. And it was actually intended to protect the metal casings of fuel tanks on rockets, on guided missiles during the Cold War. And they wanted a light solution to coat these tanks with because paint was going to make it too heavy. So they wanted something to coat these tanks with that was going to be lightweight and was going to repel water in the rain or when they had to ditch in the sea. And it took them 40 attempts to actually get it right. But even though it was intended as a means of stopping metal from going rusty, nowadays, most people use it as a lubricant. Go figure. You might say that even though they failed to actually have it used for its intended purpose, people have found another better purpose for it. So one might say that it's failed as a water displacement thing, but it's now a very, very successful lubricant, even though that wasn't what was always intended. Stuff happens. So don't see failure as defeat. It's not you against the world. And you should stop beating yourself up when things don't go to plan. Stuff happens. Get over it. And you also want to learn the difference between failure and mistakes. Some people think that the two are the same, but they're not. Failure is when you tried something with the best of intentions and it didn't work. Mistakes are when you did something that you shouldn't have done or should have known better. Basically, failure is an elimination process and mistakes are just stupid. And many of the most successful people on the planet failed before they achieved success. Henry Ford, he went bankrupt twice. Jay-Z had to start his own record label because no established label would sign him. J.K. Rowling was a penniless single mother on benefits when she wrote the first Harry Potter book. And it was rejected by 12 publishers before she finally found someone who would publish it. And the publisher who finally agreed to print it had so little faith in it, the first print run was only 1,000 copies. So they didn't expect to sell the millions that it's gone on selling. They only thought it would sell 1,000 copies, if that, and I think they gave 500 away free to libraries. So they didn't have a lot of faith in it. But if you think that's bad, Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, was rejected 30 times before it was published. In fact, the story goes that he got so frustrated at the last rejection that he threw it in the trash, and his wife went and retrieved it and said, no, you've got to keep trying. And he did, and he eliminated all the publishers who were not going to publish it and finally found the one that would do it. And of course, it's gone on to sell, umpteen different copies. Walt Disney, one of the most successful animators ever, was fired from his job on the Kansas City Star newspaper because the editor said he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Well, guess what? And of course, famously, the Beatles were rejected by the first record company that they auditioned for. They were told, oh, guitar groups are on the way out. But I suppose the person who failed the most and achieved the most in the long run was this guy, Sir Winston Churchill. Now, today, this man is revered around the world as a great wartime leader, as somebody who was truly inspirational, as someone who managed to mold the nation together, who managed to guide people, who was, truly inspirational person, who was very, very successful. But that wasn't always the story. It's not widely known, but he failed his entrance exams to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst twice. And he only passed on the third attempt because he asked to be trained as a cavalry officer, because cavalry officers didn't need the mathematics that infantry officers did. He had a quite distinguished career in the military, but he failed to win the Victoria Cross, which is the UK's highest award for gallantry, for his heroism during the Boer War, because he'd left the army to become a journalist. So some of his greatest exploits were unrecognized by the nation because he'd already left the army. And actually, if you ever see in the movie Young Winston, it's all about that time when he was in the war in South Africa. It took 3 attempts for him to get elected to Parliament the first time. And he held 5 different seats in Parliament during his career. So there were times when an election came and he got booted out and was in the so-called wilderness. And he tried an additional 2 times to get elected to Parliament and failed, even though he'd been in Parliament before. So he was 3 attempts to get elected to his first seat, and then he lost it, and then he had other attempts to try and get back into Parliament. And even when he was in Parliament, he had to sometimes change seats because there was the fear that he might get unelected at the next election. The Gallipoli landings in the Dardanelles campaign, which he helped devise, are widely considered to be one of the most disastrous campaigns of World War I. This is particularly true in countries like Britain and Australia. If you're watching this in Australia, that's probably what you've always been taught. If you're watching this in Turkey, you might perhaps have a different perspective on that. But from the Allied side, it was certainly considered to be one of the most disastrous campaigns of the First World War. His 1925 budget, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the UK's finance minister, returned the UK to the gold standard that it had been on prior to World War I, and it was disastrous. It caused a recession. It led to the general strike when the entire country came to a halt in 1926 and caused massive upheaval. And he supported Edward VIII during the abdication crisis. He didn't think that King George VI or the future King George VI would be up to the job. It's a mark of both of them that they actually became quite good friends in the end. But in the abdication crisis, he supported Edward VIII. He really backed the wrong guy. But cometh the hour, cometh the man. And it's widely acknowledged that the Allies probably would not have won World War II were it not for the inspirational leadership of Winston Churchill, because he managed to mold the nation together. He managed to inspire people on both sides of the Atlantic, in Britain and America, as to the the importance of defeating Nazi Germany. He was one of the few people who, before the war, warned of the evils of the Nazis. Lots of people ignored him. Other people who were perhaps a bit more knowledgeable paid attention. But by and large, he was ignored to begin with. But once World War II started, once he became the British Prime Minister, a couple of years into the war, he really managed to turn things around. And a lot of the things that went on in World War II would not have happened without Winston Churchill's inspirational leadership. But of course, even that ended in failure, because after World War II, people in Britain didn't want to go back to the old ways from before the war, which is what Churchill wanted, and they booted him out. So even though he won the war, he lost the peace. And that is perhaps the most ironic thing. Anyway, I want to end this video with a quote from the great man. And these are the closing remarks from a speech that he gave to students at his old school when he visited there during World War II, during the height of the war, when things were going very badly for the Allied side. And he said this: "Never give in. Never give in. Never, never, never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty. Never give in, except to convictions of honour and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy." And whether that enemy is another country if you're fighting a war, whether that enemy is just the forces that you find raged against you, never give in. Learn your lessons from your failure and move on. And of course, in the 1950s, Sir Winston Churchill became the UK's Prime Minister again.